Hello, and welcome to the May edition of the Corporate ESG 5 in 5 podcast, in which we spend 5 minutes exploring 5 key aspects of a specific ESG topic. I am Giorgio Carlucci from NatWest's ESG advisory team, and today we are going to talk about a recent statement from the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or SBTi, on the use of environmental attribute certificates, such as carbon credits, for reducing scope-free emissions. But first, let me explain what the SBTi is and why it matters for businesses and the planet. The SBTi is a corporate climate action organization which was formed as a collaboration between CDP, the United Nations Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, and the Worldwide Fund for Nature. The SBTi develops standards, tools, and guidance for companies to set greenhouse gas emission reduction targets in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. By setting science-based targets, companies can align their strategies with the best available science and demonstrate their leadership and ambition on combating climate change. By the end of 2023, more than 4,000 companies NFIs set emissions reductions target, validated by the SBTi. These companies span dozens of countries and sectors and include Apple, Coca-Cola, and Microsoft, amongst others. So what does the SBTi's statement on environmental attribute certificates say? At the start of 2024, the SBTi announced that the priority for this year was to revise its corporate net zero standard, and that this revision would include additional guidance on tackling scope-free emissions. As a reminder, scope-free emissions are considered indirect emissions, as they are the result of activities from assets not owned or controlled by the reporting organization. They either occur in the upstream or downstream activities of an organization and include, for example, emissions from buying products from suppliers, or emissions from the use of sold products, or emissions from waste disposal. For most companies, scope-free emissions represent around 70 to 90% of their total emissions. After a 6-month consultation period on its corporate net zero standard, the SBTi Board of Trustees published a statement in April, which included 5 key points. These are: the SBTi recognizes that when properly supported with the right policies, standards, and procedures based on scientific evidence, environmental attribute certificates could help reduce scope-free emissions as an extra tool to fight climate change. Therefore, the SBTi has decided to widen their use for reducing scope-free related emissions beyond the current limits. The SBTi will establish criteria and guidelines for these certificates to be valid for reducing scope-free emissions, following the principles of mitigation hierarchy. This means that the main focus should be on removing sources of emissions within the company's value chain, rather than compensating or neutralizing them. As part of the standard revision process and following consultations with all the relevant stakeholders, a preliminary draft of basic rules, thresholds, and safeguards for the possible use of environmental attribute certificates will be released by SBTi by July 2024. Given the complexity of this topic, the SBTi will aim to establish the required cooperation agreements with other related initiatives, as well as a wider group of stakeholders on the revision of the scope-free framework. The SBTi further said it will not validate the quality of carbon credits, as other entities are better positioned to do this. However, the SBTi will make sure all checking entities can access and understand its demand-side rules and limits, which were established for this purpose. Importantly, 3 days later, on the 12th of April, the SBTi clarified its Board of Trustees statement, saying it had not changed its current standards and that scientific evidence will guide any use of environmental attribute certificates for scope-free emissions. Thank you all for listening, and we look forward to welcoming you to our next month's edition of the ESG 5 in 5.